Welcome to another episode of Mystic-Skeptic Radio's Uncensored. We have a guest author. We've had many authors in the past, but today we will be discussing a new book called The Eunuch. In our different series of shows, we discuss history, biblical, like anthropology, and all kinds of stuff related to ancient cultures. So it's interesting that it's a book about being a eunuch in ancient Babylon. So, Mr. Charles Fischer, can you tell us about your background and what prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, sure. The idea for the book came to me when I was at Harvard Divinity School in the 1990s. I was studying theology there, and I had a really good friend who was doing a Ph.D. in Assyriology. She was learning ancient languages like Akkadian and Babylon, learning how to translate cuneiform tablets from the ancient Mesopotamian cultures. And that was my first exposure to that world of Babylon. And later, when I decided to write a novel, I was looking for kind of a historical period to put it in. And I remembered my good friend, Jenny Myers, who was doing her degree in Assyriology, and that kind of started my interest.
And were you studying to be a minister, or just were interested in history and theology? What was the focus?
The Harvard Divinity School has a number of different degrees you can take while there. One of them is a Master's of Divinity for those who are preparing for the ministry. I was doing an MTS, a Master of Theological Studies, and I was interested in history of religion, biblical studies, that kind of thing. It was more of an academic degree.
So when you deal with a subject such as a man being emasculated and being put in a harem, are you coming from a particular world religion perspective or just historical?
It was more historical. I wanted to write a comic novel, and I thought that was a comic situation. To a degree, the novel is about many things, but in part, it's about thwarted desire. And I suppose emasculation to a certain extent. Well, more. Actually, it is about emasculation. I was interested in that type of weakness for its comic potential, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so without going too much into politics and the culture that we live in, when you say that a man who is a eunuch is weak, are you saying that in the eyes of others, or based on their situation, because they have been stripped of their ability to have children, and that's why they're put to protect the women in the harem?
Well, it's kind of the whole life situation. My character is actually a slave. He was born in Assyria, and Nebuchadnezzar's father invaded Syria and destroyed that empire. And my character was taken as a slave as a young boy, and then castrated for the king's harem. But he's also a scribe as well, and so I was interested in that whole position of being a eunuch slave scribe. And so it's about impotence, it's about powerlessness, politically, economically, but also sexually. And I was interested in the ways that the powerless achieve power. He's not without his ability he can oppose his will on his world, and he does it primarily by telling his own story. In the novel, he purports to tell the real history behind Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Judah in 589. He's going to give what he calls the real events, and that's the eunuch slave scribe really imposing his power, his will on the narrative, the official narrative. He's writing kind of a counter history. So that I was interested in powerlessness and the way that those who are on the margins can achieve a kind of will to power. I guess Nietzsche called it ressentiment, or slave morality. So there's a little bit of that in the book as well.
So there's a couple of things that come to mind. So you know how a lot of atheists would say that the Bible has a lot of problems and it supports a lot
Sure.
of barbaric things that modern man does not appreciate. But the way that I would respond to that is that the Bible is mostly the story of the underdog and how people who were
Yeah.
oppressed by different kingdoms were able to overcome that. And then in biblical literature, and depending on which world religion you're a part of, the idea of a man not being able to have children or a woman not being able to have children was an act of shame and something that caused a lot of grief. And even nowadays, there was a case where a son and a daughter of two individuals were murdered because they were dishonoring the family because they wouldn't go get married and have babies. Do you deal with some of those issues in your book?
Not directly, no. I It's interesting that you mentioned the emotion of shame. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think that you're correct that the eunuch does feel a tremendous amount of shame for his physical condition and his inability to be with a woman in this case, because he does fall in love with one of the harem girls, and he attempts to have a relationship with her, and he really can't. And so there's shame around that for sure. Definitely. But I don't deal directly with his inability to have children, although I do think that's an interesting point. To some degree, the fact that he tells his own story, he writes it all down. It's a kind of substitute, perhaps, for having children, this act of creation. I do see writing as a kind of consolation or a compensation for some of the suffering we go through in life. And I maybe I was projecting some of that consolation onto my own narrator.
And tell us about the comedy aspect. Are you doing a Jon Stewart thing where you're kind of lampooning the current culture that we live in and the limitations on language and on being able to express some type of masculine ideas? Because
Yeah,
we
yeah,
did we did a show on the new masculinity. It was an article that said that men needed to be more like women to be able to survive in society or get
sure.
along with females. And there's extremes. We don't support the idea that men are being oppressed and stuff like that, but we can see that in the culture there
Yeah,
is bullying going on all sides, and sometimes there's an over response where people get so
yeah,
radical that they want to dismiss anything that comes from a perspective that has been oppressive.
yeah,
Where How did you go about discussing that, if that is one of the
yeah.
subjects
No, that's a great question, David. Yeah, I was in graduate school in the 1990s, and that was kind of one of the first waves of the culture war. And I definitely, when I was at Harvard Divinity School, and I loved HDS, but there was a certain amount of, I would say, low level animosity directed at towards men. Um, and it was low level, it was indirect, but you had to be kind of careful about what you said, and what you did. I remember when I first got there, a good friend of mine who had been there a year warned me not to date any women at HDS because the sexual politics were so controversial at the time. Um, when I arrived there, a young man had gotten kicked out because I don't know the full story, but he had a relationship went bad, and he was emotionally upset, and he went to the girl's room a couple of times to talk about it, and she thought he was stalking her, and he was literally dismissed from the divinity school. And people were not really sure about that dismissal. think it was a little controversial, but so that was kind of the atmosphere when I arrived there. You just had to be kind of careful. The rules were changing. And by then I realized I wanted to be a writer, but I knew that I couldn't really write about masculinity, sex, and power the way that my father's generation did. I'm thinking of the great Jewish writers, Norman Mailer, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, that if I wrote like them, and I really admired these guys, it would be, politically dangerous, right? And so I was trying to figure out a way to write about masculinity, sex, and power. And so I thought I'll write from the point of view of an emasculated narrator. I'll be safe from political criticism. I can mock this my own kind of powerless as a man, and also examine it. And so that was definitely part of my narrative choices. And I agree with you. I think we need to kind of find a happy medium between the old and new ways. I'm certainly not opposed to feminism, and the patriarchy was a very real thing for members of my mother's generation. But yeah, perhaps there's been an overcorrection, in the last generation or so. So anyway, I was in the midst of all that stuff. So your question, I think, was on point.
Can you educate us about the masculine authors? Because
Yeah.
for some of us who are only read certain type of literature,
Yeah.
when we hear the feminist movement, the current one, say we need to take down the patriarchy, I can connect with them in the sense of men who have abused their power, men who have oppressed women, men who have
Totally.
behaved in a non-honorable way should be called out, should be held accountable. But the whole idea that all these institutions who have existed for thousands of years are now questioned from their inception, that if a culture in ancient times had a patriarchy, that culture was wrong. It seems like a very modern kind of going back in time and judging them and condemning them when that's what worked for them, even though it was abused. So church, synagogues, politics, everything is being questioned. And then what is it being replaced with? So in politics, I can see how there's been a lot of prejudice and mistreatment of women and not allowed to have position of power. But in religion, it comes from whatever cultural stuff was going on back then, and safety and ability to fight wars and things like that. So it seems like that putting the same type of criticism and sometimes even hatred towards certain institutions, it kind of puts everything in a flux and again, it goes back to what are you replacing with, and is what we're replacing it with more just, more valuable and holy than what you're complaining about. So tell us what they were saying, and what did they have any merit with the way that we're discussing the masculine?
Well, a lot of it was generational. The writers that I mentioned, Norman Mailer, for example, fought in World War II. He was born in the middle 1920s. Saul Bellow was more of my grandfather's generation. He was born, I think, 1915. Philip Roth was born in the 1930s. And so here you've got guys that grew up, in the middle of the 20th century. And, times have changed since then. So their perspective, was a little different than my generation. I'm a very late boomer. I was born in 1961, and certainly different than the generations like what they call Generation X or the millennials and now Zoomers. The 20th century was a different world, particularly these guys who grew up in the Depression, World War II, the Korean War. And they were also Jews, Jewish writers, and they were trying to, break through the various barriers, the anti-Semitic barriers that were still in place in the 20th century. I think it's a very complicated situation. the generation of Mailer and Roth, they went through the 60s and saw the rise of feminism, and they were attacked by feminists for their so-called misogyny. My father was that generation too. There was a kind of a soft misogyny. They weren't like beating women or anything like that. Although Mailer did he did stab one of his wives. Philip Roth wrote about womanizers and philanderers. And I think a lot of women objected to the way some of these guys objectified women or portrayed them negatively in their fiction. And in that way, they were seen as maybe reactionary and patriarchal. But they were great writers, brilliant minds, great stylists, took on big topics. I loved their work and was influenced by them, but I realized I couldn't hold some of their same social attitudes, and I didn't really, frankly. Times have changed, and now in the 21st century, things are radically different. More young women graduate from college and dominate law schools and med schools than young men do. In fact, there's a real crisis amongst the youth today, both young women and young men, and I'm particularly worried about the young men who are withdrawing into the internet and video games and pornography. So I don't know. It's a big topic. I find myself a little inarticulate about it.
Well, two things related to that was my wife was reading a book in relation to can you love the artist? Can you love the art and hate the artist?
Oh, I know that book, right? Yeah.
And there are certain people that I want nothing to do with them, like Woody Allen or someone like that, where
Sure. Yeah.
even though he has created great stuff, I could care less about him as a person. And then there's from Michael Jackson all the way to Polanski and stuff like that. But in relation to men being the great painters or the great authors of poetry and things like that, we have to kind of like the historical components either play an important role because that's what shaped what they said, or they're just background information for some great works. Now, when it comes down to the Bible, a lot of people have similar concerns where the women are always portrayed in a negative light.
Yeah, sure.
And the men are heroic, but they're very flawed, and they keep giving chances. So how did you discuss the situation with your character, especially since being a eunuch is not only about not having the ability to have children, it's almost like a disability, and there was rules against priests having any type of special abilities in the temple, in the Israelite religion. And then in the Greeks and the Romans, if anybody's seen the 300 movie, they would toss you into a pile of skulls if you were not strong enough or what they considered ideal male to be able to fight in battle. So is there an aspect of him being someone that has been not only marginalized but completely dismissed as a human being, and then him being able to overcome that and find a way to find a place in this world?
Yeah, he definitely occupies a low status position in the Babylonian court of Nebuchadnezzar. And yet he has his own kind of power. He's close with the king. He keeps the records of the king's harem. He is, in effect, the king's body man. He hangs out with him, becomes his confidant and friend. And so there's this kind of master-servant relationship. And, the slave servant has their own kind of power. They know the secrets. They know he knows the emotional vulnerabilities and weaknesses of the king. He's around in unofficial situations, behind closed doors. He hears the conversations, and that's a tremendous kind of power. And he uses that power for his own advantage. And so I was interested in exploring that kind of position in society.
And how much of the character is autobiographical because
Right.
one of my favorite shows is Star Trek, the original one, and they had limited budget, they had limited technology, but they were able to write great stories that were social commentary. And
Sure.
but because they put it in the future and in a more utopian world, they were able to get away with more than if they did it in the 1960s with what was going
Yeah,
on. So
exactly.
you
Right.
going back in time, does that give you an opportunity to have more freedom?
That's a brilliant question. I really think that there is a relationship between historical novels and science fiction. In fact, I go as far and say that historical novels are science fiction because they're both speculative, and often, whether you're writing about the future or the past, it's a coded commentary on the present, right? And so, what it does is you create this alternative world, right? In the case of my novel, it's 6th century BCE Babylon, and then you create an alter ego or persona, a narrator who is a stand-in for yourself. The narrator is both you, but not you. So there are definitely parts of me in the narrator, but I use the narrator. His name is Nurgle, by the way, to say things that I want to say. But I can also use Nurgle, as a kind of mask, to say things that that I personally would never say, right? That are not about me, right? You can just do so much more when you put on that mask and create a fictional character. It's a little bit like acting, right? Or when an actor takes on a role, you have to make it real. There's a certain truth to method acting, but also you're projecting and making up things as well, and trying to make them as believable and plausible. So, yeah, both the historical setting and the character are kind of analogs for myself. They're not me. It's not our world, but it's a reflection, kind of a cracked mirror, if that makes sense. I'm looking at myself through a cracked mirror and gazing at history through a cracked mirror. And
Well, and one reason that the Bible is compelling is because the stories are very human. Everybody still has the same desires, the same,
yeah,
visions for the future, the things they want to pursue, and people can relate to them. What is your approach in considering biblical like narratives and incorporating them into your work? Because a lot of people, they feel that unless you're quoting Bible verses and showing the correlation with what happened, that it is not worthwhile to even look at it. This would be from an evangelical or Catholic perspective. And then the other people who don't consider the Bible to be God's word, they think that it's up for grabs. You can do whatever you want with the text. So I'm thinking of Anita Diamond taking a lot of liberties and kind of adding her own theories about how God was developed from different deities from the Canaanites. Do you hold to a specific worldview when you're writing these narratives, or do you take all these new historical perspectives into consideration to make the story more full?
well, I was trying to recreate 6th century Babylon. And of course, it's going to be a recreation. It's going to be a work of fiction. There's no way I could accurately portray 6th century Babylon in fiction. I did a tremendous amount of research, had a big bibliography, right? But anything I would write about it is purely speculative, right? There's no way I could inhabit that world. I don't speak the languages. It's a strange and foreign world. But I wanted to give kind of it's more like a simulation, right? A plausible version. I wanted to make it as accurate. It had to sound accurate and be believable. But of course, it's just all made up, right? So there's an appearance of accuracy. I got the names right. I got the places right. I got the food that they ate. I created a voice and a style that didn't sound real contemporary, but it's all an illusion of the past. It's not I'm not capturing the past. It's not a documentary or anything. There's no way you could do that. I think that's true with even the really best examples of historical fiction, right? It's an imagined reality, an imagined recreation. I mean, the chronological difference between our world and their world, the number of years is just too great, right? Different religion, different languages. Right? I'm a 20th century. I was born in the 20th century, primarily, in a world based on rationalism and materialism, and so my attempt to kind of recreate the religious and political world of 6th century Babylon is going to be just speculation, but I wanted it to be at least plausible, so the reader would feel a kind of the difference and be transported into another world. But it's all kind of make believe. Now, as to your question about the Bible, I have kind of two experiences of the Bible. I was raised in the Midwest in a Christian culture, and I had a lot of exposure to the evangelical approach to the Bible, which was fairly literalist, right? They believed that the Bible was the Word of God. It was inherent. Every word was correct and inspired by the Holy Spirit, right? And so when I was a young man, I would read the New Testament and take it literally, and found a tremendous amount of consolation in that. But later on, when I went to a Lutheran college in southern Minnesota, St. Olaf College, and studied religion there. And then I ended up at Harvard Divinity School, and I was exposed to the higher criticism, where you would historicize the Bible, and you read it as a book written by real people for in real communities, and there's a certain amount of demythologizing that takes place with that approach. And in my 30s, when I was doing this, I found that invigorating and refreshing, and as a corrective to the kind of evangelical approaches of my youth, right? But now in late middle age, early old age, I'm 62 years old. I have kind of a middle way. I like both approaches. I don't really consider myself a Christian, or if I am a Christian, I'm a very bad Christian. But I see the good in both approaches, if that makes sense. And I recognize those are only two approaches. There are other ways to approach the scripture, but those are the two that I've been most exposed to.
So there's been a long history of Orientalism, where people are fascinated with the Middle East, with the ancient cultures, and it's, a lot of stuff has been written or art created about it. But what is the role of the current Middle East crisis and the many issues going around? Iraq was decimated through two different wars, and even stuff was being smuggled out by the owner of Hobby Lobby was stealing relics from over there.
Yeah, great question.
And there was a lot of conservative politicization, and even they were using prophecies from Revelation to justify destroying Baghdad and all that stuff. So how do you connect that type of situation to your book, and do you educate people about the richness of Babylonian culture?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, no, in some ways the book was inspired by the Iraq War of 2003. In fact, the frame of the book, if you read the introduction to the book, it's kind of a mock academic introduction. The novel is a translation of cuneiform tablets that were unearthed during the Iraq War. The U.S. Army invaded Baghdad in March of 2003. And the Museum of Antiquities was sacked, and over 15,000 objects were lost and went on the black market. And my novel is based on this idea or premise that a number of these tablets made their way to a used bookstore in the United States, and one of the night clerks at this bookstore found these tablets And the tablets are purported versions of the Babylonian Chronicles, which are these actual historical tablets that narrate the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And my novel, The Eunuch, is a translation of those tablets. But the translation is a forgery because the book clerk that found the tablets did not know Akkadian or Babylonian, and he just kind of made it up. But he made up a very good, historically plausible version of the story. So there's kind of a farcical element behind that. But to the larger question of the U.S. Involvement in the Middle East, yes, the book is very much about that. I was appalled when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, in part because I think that the government lied to us. There were no weapons of mass destruction, and I don't think Saddam Hussein or Iraq had any relationship to the attacks on 9/11 in New York, although the United States claimed that they did. And so what I wanted to do, I realized that, there are unintended consequences for something like that. When we invaded Iraq, we had no idea of the result, right? And which we are now seeing, and we have been seeing for the last 20 years or so, the unintended consequences of that war. And so I wanted to write an analog to that. And my novel is about Babylon's invasion of Judah in 589 and all the unintended consequences of that, because he razed the city, destroyed the temple, and initiated the Babylonian captivity, right? And I'm not sure it's the beginning of the diaspora, but it's part of the larger Jewish diaspora, and which have had tremendous historical consequences over the last 2,000 years. And so my book is a little bit about when a powerful empire invades a smaller nation with the attitude, what can possibly go wrong? That was our attitude. We're going to invade Iraq. What can possibly go wrong? And so my book is definitely a commentary on that situation.
Another question, and we can finish it up at the other side of the break, is the term eunuch is used by Jesus in one of the Gospels.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of problems with that, because being Jewish, for a Jewish mystic, and some people say he was a prophet, some people say he's the Messiah and all that. For him to say that his followers can be eunuchs or become eunuchs, or they were born eunuchs, goes against Jewish law and Jewish culture, that a man who's a eunuch cannot partake of the temple. A man who's a eunuch is seen as someone who's not able to, fulfill their role, as like one of the commandments is to have children. So if you're born with it, okay, but now he's saying that you can become a spiritual eunuch, or you can choose to be a eunuch, and that's where a lot of people say comes the idea of being a monastic. So in Roman culture, the men who were the eunuchs of the harems or whatever they had in the king's court, they were powerful men, but they were held under a chain, like they were like a dog in a chain. So I don't know if you have any insight in the Christian version of a eunuch, other than a priest or someone who denies themselves. And people can say that, Jesus was the first priest, and then his followers became priests, and then Paul was preaching that. But it seems foreign to me. Even for a long time, they said that Dead Sea Scroll community were all monastic, and now they found some bones of women. So in Judaism, I can see that some people will stop partaking of sexual relations if they reach a higher level of spirituality. There's a midrash about Moses becoming like that at the end of his life, being so holy that he didn't need that. But have you come across any of the Western and Christian interpretations in relation to being a eunuch, in relation to the Romans and the Greeks? And we're about to close off this segment, so if you can respond to that on the other side of the break.
Well, during the break, I printed out Matthew 19:12 to help answer your question. I haven't looked at this verse in a while, although I was aware of it when I was writing the book. and thought about using part of it as an epigram, a beginning quote for the novel. And so in it, Jesus is talking about all the different kinds of eunuchs. My character, Nergal, is a eunuch who was made that way by men. He wasn't born that way. He didn't choose to become a eunuch for the kingdom of God. He was made a eunuch by men. Right. He was castrated by a powerful king of an empire. And so his situation is about enslavement and power. But that position gives him a certain insight, perhaps. He claims it gives him a certain kind of wisdom, even a prophetic wisdom. Right. He's had his, what he calls his organs of regeneration have been taken away from him. Right. And so all that desire has to be sublimated someplace else. It has to go somewhere. And Nergal, my narrator, claims that sublimated desire has provided him with a kind of insight into the world. So that's about as far as I took it when I was thinking about the novel and writing it.
I have something controversial to say, so bear with me. So
sure.
I interviewed my friend John Dominic Crossan on our show. He's been here 5 times, and a YouTube subscriber was making fun of me because I said, "Can you emasculate God?" And in modern terms, God doesn't have any physicality or male or female characteristics. That's how most people would think of God, as almost like the Force from Star Wars. But the God that is described in the Bible has both masculine and feminine attributes, and he describes himself mostly in masculine terms in the Hebrew. But then there are some passages where it talks about wisdom. It talks about in Isaiah that like a mother who loves her newborn child, that's how God loves Israel. So there are in Jewish thought is that he's whole, he's complete. He and humans are a reflection of him, and men have some attributes of God and women have some attributes of God. So now with the whole thing going on with can women become priests, and is there such as other possibilities and alternatives, stuff like that, is creating a lot of traditionalist people are kind of flipping out because they feel that the traditional modes of viewing God, which are mostly male, are being questioned and even thrown out. And there's a book, and I haven't had a chance to read it. It's called The Phallus of God, and it discusses. You can go back into Canaanite theology and how they had a male deity for fertility. The harvest and stuff like that in relation to planting a seed or whatever. And then you have the female deity, which represents the womb of the earth and giving life. So all those elements are important. Once you start throwing them out, tossing them around, then there is some theological confusion. But I find it almost beautiful that you're saying that a man who has limited capacity when it comes down to his sexuality, he has like a special gift, because that would be similar to the Greeks, where the whole idea of being a monk or a nun comes from the Greco-Roman idea that some people devoted themselves to Athena or to one of the other deities in complete devotion, and they gave up their sexuality in a sense to pursue the higher things of life. And that gives them a special gift, an ability to see things, to experience things, and to communicate things that other people who are stuck in their passions are not able to. Do you see Paul's proposition that people should pursue God instead of a family, which is mentioned in one of his letters, kind of like that idea of a eunuch, someone who takes a different approach, that instead of worrying of the things of life and your own passions, you're worried about the higher things?
Yeah, I'm no New Testament theologian, but what your comments about Paul sound about right. He certainly was pretty stringent about sexual matters. And from what I know of New Testament theology, you've got the vision of Jesus in the Gospels, right? The synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then you've got, the great mystical text, the book of John, right? And then you've got the letters of Paul. And, arguably Paul invented Christianity. He's the first great reader of the Jesus text. And well, in fact, his letters were perhaps written before any of the Gospels were written down. But of course, many of those stories existed in the communities in oral tradition. And again, I say this as a complete amateur when it comes to New Testament studies. So, I mean, Paul's view of sexuality is probably different than Jesus's view, or arguably, right? And do we know what Jesus's view of sexuality is? We just have the story of his life, and his deeds and his sayings that were written down by the early Christian communities, and to the degree that they're accurate, that's up in the air, right? It's purely speculative. But yeah, Paul was pretty strict when it came to sexuality, pretty much the aesthetic, right? I don't really have any thoughts on that. I think that's one approach, right? The approach of renunciation. There's power in renunciation. We live in a world where everybody likes to indulge their passions for the most part, right? Fulfill their desires, right? And there's a lot to be said for that as well, but it's kind of one-sided, and so lifestyles that emphasize renunciation have a certain attraction, I think, in the 21st century right now, just as a kind of a counter argument to the kind of prevailing zeitgeist.
Well, and not to get too much in the weeds on the other programs we've done, but I do want to get back to your book. But there is something that we have been describing in the book, that Jesus' Jewish identity can be portrayed in a modern Jewish perspective, which is, Jews are meant to get married, Jews are meant to have families, Jews are meant to keep the commandments the way that they're defined or interpreted nowadays. But back then, the mystical groups were very radical, and they saw almost like mortification as a virtue. And it was a sacrifice to God to give up your sexuality, to give up your desires. So some people have said, well, we know Jesus was not who Christians claim to be, because he didn't do what a Jew from the first century should have done, and that is to get married and have a family. But if you look at it as a member of a persecuted group, a member of a fringe radical group, that wasn't a priority for him. A priority for him was to spread his message. So he had a sacrificial aspect of his life that he wasn't pursuing. And Jeremiah did some of that. In Jewish interpretation, they say Jeremiah actually had a daughter somehow, but in the scripture it says that God told him that he couldn't get married because he needed to pursue his prophetic role. So back to your book, the relationship between the characters in the woman in the harem, do you incorporate the woman's perspective? Because the last author that we had was talking about having female characters that are stronger and have more developed characteristics as compared to the Bible. And then what is the role of women who in modern perspective would be trafficked or enslaved for sexual pleasure of the kings? Is that play a role, the injustice of what the women were going through as well as him?
Yeah, absolutely. The women in the harem, and there are over 300 young women in Nebuchadnezzar's harem are all enslaved. And yes, that would be considered sex trafficking, right? They were abducted in wartime from their homes. They witnessed their families murdered, and they went through terrible trauma on the journey, their deportation from their homes to Babylon, and then they become essentially these sex slaves to the king. And Nergal is privy to all that. He spends a lot of time with these women, and he hears all their stories. And their stories shock and alarm him, and he records them in his chronicle of his history of Babylon, for sure. And he gets to know a number of these women quite well. In particular, he gets to know the head of the harem, who's an old haremite. Her name is Madame Grape, and she's in her 70s. And she used to be the alpha haremite to Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar. And in fact, she's one of the best characters, one of the characters I'm most proud of in the novel. And I tried to make her three-dimensional, fully developed. She's probably the most sympathetic and best character in the novel. And then he also gets to know another younger harem girl quite well. Her name is Feduri. And I took her name after a character in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And Nergal falls in love with her, gets to know her and her story quite well. So yeah, I wanted to portray their reality, these enslaved young women. It was a large part of the novel, is kind of getting their voices heard.
Because the challenge, when we tell the story of Purim, and even Esther is a heroine of Jewish history, she has to be the most beautiful, the most lovely for the king to take on as his wife, but he still has a bunch of other wives. And it's almost like a Cinderella story and a competition to get his love, when we know he was a tyrant and he was forcing women, and he kicked out his other wife because he thought she was insolent. So in trying to educate young people about the Bible, we have to sometimes make little changes here and there, so it doesn't look as such a chauvinistic tyrannical story, because at the end it's about God bringing about redemption or whatever, but in the midst of it, there's all these cultural issues of, you not only you have a Jewish woman marrying a non-Jew to protect her people, but she is being cryptic, and then all the other women are being tossed around like property in the story. And you see that also with Tamar and Judah. So there's a lot of injustices that are depicted in the Bible as normal, as something you just should know, that beautiful women get treated better than women who are not attracted to men. And you see that with the story of Jacob and the two daughters of Laban. So is there an aspect also of women being exploited and sexualized for the harem, and how the king treats them and he has his favorites?
Well, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, the situation of my novel was that the king himself is like an aging rock star. And he's indulged himself in every possible sexual experience possible, right? Has slept with thousands of women, and he's basically exhausted. He's bored. He's impotent. And having an impotent king in Babylon is a political problem, because because the religion of Babylon was a fertility religion. And every year during the New Year's rite, the king would have to publicly consummate a relationship with a sacred prostitute in a public ritual. You'd have to copulate with a sacred prostitute in front of the entire court. And if that act was completed and successful, it would ensure the fertility for the next year. But Nebuchadnezzar in my version of the story is impotent, because he's basically effed out, right? And that's a real problem for the king's ministers and his counselors and his priests. Can't have an impotent king. And moreover, to complicate matters politically, there's been a 10-year drought in Babylon, and famine is on the land. And so the fact of the king's impotence is it's a agricultural problem as well as a political problem. And my narrator Nergal, right, who's the king's harem scribe, tries to solve this problem and help the king with his own impotence. Right. So I really haven't quite answered your question, but prior to the king's impotence, yes, there's a tremendous amount of sexualization and exploitation of the young women in the harem. That's what harems are for, right? It's not a just or equitable relationship, and so yeah, that is portrayed in my novel. Some of that backstory of the king's prior relationship to the harem before he becomes impotent. But yeah, so that's the kind of narrative situation of the book.
So if you look at the life of Solomon, having is it 700 wives and 300 concubines, or the other way around?
I don't remember, but it was, there's 1,000 women, and he had experienced everything there is in life, right? And he found it all vanity.
So there is a lesson to be learned, but it's also the excesses of power, and even in some cultures, still, the more mistresses you have, the more of a man you are, and the more status you have. Same in the Middle Eastern culture. If you have 4 wives, that means that you are doing well for yourself, but you have to provide equally to all of them. So the power dynamic. Thinking about a rock star, did you think also about politicians? How now it's coming out that most politicians have mistresses and long relationships that kind of influence their decision.
Yeah, when I was writing my character Nebuchadnezzar, I saw him as kind of a weak king, and from my political perspective back then, I thought he was kind of a George Bush, but really he's kind of a combination of George Bush and Bill Clinton. Right, Clinton is the one with all the mistresses, whereas Bush, as far as we know, is faithful to his wife. So he's kind of a combination of those two presidents. But yeah, it's about corruption and power for sure.
That's interesting, because that was the first thing that came to mind when you said the 1990s and eunuchs. I thought of Bill Clinton, and I saw the recreation of that story and what happened, and how there's a lot of freedom. Until he got caught, it wasn't even an issue. So you have someone who's a sexual deviant in some people's eyes, and then you have someone who has sexually impotent, being the eunuch. Is there a back and forth on someone who has access to all the women they want and is not enough, or it's boring, and then someone who doesn't have it and is frustrated, but he still can love and he can still have a relationship?
Yeah, I mean that's really the heart of the book. You just described the heart of the book. The book is very much about the relationship between the eunuch and the king. The king who has access to everything, all women, and is exhausted and bored and has no love in his life. And then the eunuch who has no access to women, but desires very much love and connection. And he still retains the ability to love. And it's about that back and forth.
Wow, that's very powerful. In the last 10 minutes, can you tell us about other projects you might be working on, or how long did it take you to write the book, and what are your suggestions for new authors and how they can get going?
Yeah. Well, it took me a long time to write the book. It took 10 years to write the book, in part because I was working full time. I'm a teacher at a community college just north of Seattle, Washington. And so when I wasn't teaching, I was writing. So I would only have a couple hours a day. And it took about 10 years to write. There was a lot of research. And also when I started, I didn't really know how to write a novel. To write a novel, you need to do about 10 to 12 things pretty well as a writer, right? You need to be able to write dialogue. You need to do description. You need to be pretty good at exposition. You need to come up. I mean, it's one thing to write a good paragraph. It's another thing to write a good chapter, right? Writing a good chapter was a challenge, but I finally figured that out. I remember when I wrote my first good paragraph. I remember when I finished the first chapter of the novel that I was happy with. But a novel really has about 20 chapters, or my novel had about 23 chapters, and getting those episodes to hold together, that's another matter. entirely. So I had to kind of learn how to write a novel as I was writing it, and for a while that, in part, that contributed to the length of time that it took me to complete my project. But I did enjoy it. It was fun learning all those things. My advice to writers is, dream big, be ambitious. You don't know what you're capable of doing until you try it. Write every day. Set a word count or a page limit and try to hit it every day. If you write a page a day, within a year you'll have a manuscript. You'll have 300 pages, and that's enough. That's a first draft. And then once you have a first draft, that then begins the long process of revision and rewrite, which can be actually quite fun. The great American Russian novelist, when he was teaching his course on the European novel in Cornell in the 1950s, he was giving advice to his students on how to become a good reader. And he said that there's no such thing as a good reader. There are only good rereaders. And I would say that's true with writing. There are no good writers. There are only good rewriters. And so I would tell people who are aspiring to write to spend a lot of time in revision.
What was the name of the Russian American author?
Vladimir Nabokov. He's most famous perhaps for a book called Lolita.
And are you working on any projects currently?
Yes, I am. I'm working on a second novel. It's about a young man with autism who lives in the basement of his mother, and he's unemployed, and he's not going to school. He spends most of his time on the internet, either playing video games or on image boards like 4chan. I don't know if you're familiar with 4chan, but it's an image board where a lot of young people, mostly young men, congregate and talk about their unhappiness, their mental struggles, but their problems with employment and their general inability to launch and acculturate to the larger world. It's a community of deeply disaffected, marginalized young men who often become radicalized by politically dangerous ideas. And so I'm writing a short novel this time about the life of one of these young men.
You mentioned Lolita, and that was that's a hot topic in relation to, again, exploiting women,
Yeah.
seeing younger women as something to predate on or be a predator.
Right.
And how it's so disappointing that both political parties had people participating in the Epstein sex ring.
Right. No,
Uh,
right. Yes.
So
Yeah.
go ahead.
Lolita is a great novel. It's told from the point of view of a terrible human being, a sexual predator by the name of Humbert Humbert. And Humbert, as a narrator, is a very charming and funny and brilliant guy who masks his he's essentially a pedophile, but he masks his illicit desires in terms of the tradition of romantic love. He's always quoting poets and making references to true love and passion. And so if you're not careful as a reader, you can believe every word he says and even root for him in his attempted seduction of the 12-year-old girl, Dolores Hayes. It's kind of a trick novel. Nabokov kind of seduces the reader in rooting for essentially a predatory sociopath.
But it's interesting that the next book is about an incel and someone who has
Right.
I think some of them have taken a vow of chastity because they wanted to kind of stick it to the man or to women that they don't need them, and then they go into radicalized mentality, almost like a terroristic ideas to use that energy for evil. So it's interesting that in your book you're talking about someone who has limitation, has inabilities, and he's using it for the better, for true love and compassion and commitment. So I want to thank you for, even though they're very difficult conversations to have, that we're able to discuss them and to give people alternatives, because I think that for people to understand each other, we have to have these topics being addressed in a thorough way,